I think there was some, that was some of the edits that were around that stuff. But I can, what I'll do is I'll go back into that PR and I'll summarize sort of like the changes in sort of, easier to digest snippet bullet points.
Yeah, I don't know that you need to do that. I was actually just thinking of merging it, and then we can iterate and improve it as we go.
Yeah, I'd love to at least have Caleb take a look at this stuff, because I don't want to, like, it's always a little bit tricky when you're doing this sort of like, having a bunch of folks pile on type of thing. And
yeah, it would have been a little bit easier if it were done in 2 steps. One, just inject the metadata and update the metadata. And the other is like changing the explanations and moving stuff around.
Yeah.
I guess also I missed the instructions at the top. The commented section there.
What's that? I'm sorry,
the commented section. I guess I do miss that for people when you fork it.
Okay. Oh, you mean for the template?
Yeah, so I guess that was Brian's, at least I was trying to address Brian's comment that it should be empty so you can fill out. So if it's empty, then you need instructions about what to put in there, or like where to find the information to put in there. So it's like this hack for comments and markdowns. You don't see it on GitHub, but you do see it when you fork it.
Yeah, I let's see. So, I mean, that was a different commit. I mean, I can drop that and actually make that be a different thing, like the file rename stuff, because that's definitely one thing. I did have, like, if you look under the title thing, I do have to get started with this template type of thing. And I wanted to be clear of some of the naming dance that we're going to have to do based on, like, well, you're not going to know what the sort of draft number is until you submit the PR. And so that means that you have to create the file, submit the PR, rename it, repush, right, to actually get the number in there based on PR.
I was thinking that was and I guess following the Rust RFC process, that's work done by the editorial team, since they know what the PR number is when they merge it. So if you're an author, you don't have to deal with that.
Okay, but Rust does this thing where, like, they don't use the GitHub Merge stuff, right?
They have an auto or incrementing number, but it's the same concept because you know what the number is going to be ahead of time.
Okay, so the thing that we talked about on the doc was, and I think, and I don't have, we just needed to do something here, so I'm happy to, and we're jumping right into this stuff. The thing that I have in the doc right now is that when things are in a draft state, they have a number that's based on PR, and we know those will get big and unreadable, and only Brian will remember them because he has a special gift. And then, I'm actually being respectful there, Brian. I actually think it's really cool that you can remember this stuff. And then I think as it moves to the accepted stage, then we sort of renumber it with a non-draft dense number.
Possibly. I mean, maybe in the future. I mean, we only have 1,100 of these pull requests against community in total, like years in. So, like, a 4-digit number is not terrible. Like, when we get to like 5 or 6, I think maybe that would be.
Well, another issue is I think it's likely that we're going to move this to another repo again or something. So maybe if PR numbers are too much of a hassle in any form, we go back to initially a date-based number. And
that'd be great. So it's like draft and then like date and then the title, and that at least makes them sort of roughly sort when they're in draft state, and then when they get accepted, give them an official number, and that official number is a thing that the editor does.
Yes.
So
okay. Yeah. No, I'll do that.
Date-based where UTC. It's. I guess until you have the problem, I'd rather personally punt on the numbering, because like numbering is easy. You can just change the number later.
I'm not sure I agree with that, Caleb. I mean, people refer to these things. I mean, like changing an RFC number, like, oh, it's not 1918 anymore, it's actually 12. I mean, it's going to be, these things get embedded in terms of the way.
Like, I don't want to keep breaking crosslinks between proposals. Yeah. I mean, the move will probably do that, but like, we refer to these proposals all over the place in many different forms, and I'd rather us get I don't think pull request is a good number. Like each of the, like if these are important enough that the whole project is organized around agreeing to as the direction for the project, why wouldn't they have their own number? Like, I've never seen a project that doesn't have a unique numbering scheme for their proposals.
Yeah, where we settled in the proposal was have some kind of temporary number, and then once it was approved, it would get assigned an official dense sequential number, so that they would be short and memorable, and we wouldn't have trouble with collisions, and we wouldn't have trouble with repo moves and all that kind of stuff. So, and it would be something that an editor could do. So we just need like a placeholder before the approval state.
So I hate to be a pain here, but Doug has a conflict at the top of the hour, and he has a relatively quick thing that we can discuss. Is it possible?
Yeah, we're jumping the gun. Why don't we have it on the thing? Let's get to it.
Okay. Well, so the other thing I want to say about this, I would like to close on this last set of changes by the end of the week, so we at least have like a reasonably complete stake in the ground. There's also a design proposal template. I don't remember how it got created. In the design proposals directory, there's a design proposal template.md that we should just get rid of.
Yeah.
I think it is more discoverable there, so we may want to move the kept stuff up out of SIG architecture and put it at the top level.
I think Caleb had that in the proposal, that's where the template at least would end up.
So anyway, let's iterate on that.
Let's talk about that when we get to that item. I don't want to usurp the schedule here.
So Jace, what is on the agenda other than?
So we have a thing from Doug and Paul, how to deal with NS and non-NS versions of a resource. And it's got a 15-minute time box. So if we start now, we should be done about 5 minutes before the hour.
Yeah, so Paul wanted to articulate the problem for you guys. So Paul, I think you're on the call, right?
Yeah, so here's the TLDR. There are, in the service catalog problem space, Cloud Foundry, what they do for their marketplace, which is equivalent functionally, at least at a high level, to our service catalog, is there are 2 different flavors of service brokers that you can add. You can add ones that are globally available within a Cloud Foundry installation, and then you can add brokers that are private to a coordinate in their organization scheme or organizational scheme, which is called actually organization. So there are 2 different levels of these brokers, and they have fairly sophisticated permissioning setup that allows you to, yeah, I see those eyebrows, Joe. I agree. My eyebrows agree, at least. They have a fairly robust permissioning system that lets you expose different services and plans that come from these brokers to other organizations or expose them to everybody. We obviously do not have such capability in Kubernetes right now. And what we initially have done for Service Catalog is that brokers and services and plans, which are things that come from brokers, are global. They're not namespaced. I've had a number of users and folks in the community ask about whether they will be able to ever have a namespaced version of a broker and attendant plans and services. And so the problem facing us is potentially we'll have namespaced and non-namespaced versions of similar, if not identical, resources. I don't think we want to try to make the same resource both namespaced and non-namespaced. So that implies that we make 2 different resources. The question that Doug and I have is what should we do naming-wise, assuming that the rest of our logic that we'll actually have separate resources. People agree with that.
Okay, I have a question for you, Paul.
Yes.
Why are the existing resources not namespaced?
So the existing resources aren't namespaced because we did not want to have individuals have to add a broker to their namespace. We wanted to have an operator add a broker once and for everybody to see those service classes and service plans.
Yeah, it'd be super annoying. It'd be super annoying, right? Like you wanted to add a service to your cluster, and you'd have to add it to every namespace that existed, as well as every namespace that came into existence.
No, I guess my question is, why can't you access a service in another namespace? So within Google, we don't have service brokers, but we do have lots of shared services, and those shared services effectively are in the namespaces corresponding to the teams that run them, and we have like 10,000 of these teams.
So to answer your question, Brian, I think that we made this decision originally because we didn't want to have to work through all the challenges associated with cross namespace references, which I don't think we have anywhere else in Kubernetes right now. I think that if we, and I assume that we'll eventually have robust capabilities in that area. And at that time, what we could do is we could deprecate the global resources.
What do you mean by cross namespace references?
So, Brandon, say that we had, instead of these global resources, that we had namespace versions of broker, service plan, and service class. It would be, by cross namespace references, I mean, it's conceivable that in a setup like that, you might have a dedicated namespace to hold shared service and plans that, like, say an administrator wants to set up a namespace to hold services and plans that are shared across multiple namespaces. So in that scheme, you would have a user make a service instance of a service class and service plan that's in another namespace.
I have another question, which is, I feel like this is data plane auth. And do we really believe that Kubernetes should take on data plane auth? Like, the reason you're trying to model things this way is because the service, you're trying to emulate the auth model of the service broker, right? And maybe we should just say, like, that's the service broker's business to figure out its auth model.
This isn't that exact problem, Brennan. So there's another facet that is, what type of auth does the broker perform to say whether you're allowed to do a particular thing? But there's another layer in Kubernetes, I think.
Well, but if you're not worrying about auth, then I guess I don't understand the cross-reference problem, because, like, it's there, it's part of a different namespace. Why not reach across? Auth will be taken care of by somebody else.
So specifically, it's a reference from a service that is provisioned by a broker back to the broker that provisioned it. That's the reference?
The reference is the Kubernetes service instance resource in namespace X, referencing a Kubernetes service class and Kubernetes service plan resource in namespace Y.
Okay.
But I mean, it's just a link, right? Like, why does it matter?
Well, but just to be clear, it's not just a cross-reference problem to me. It's you know, if you want a particular namespace to see other namespaces services, then you have to do some action to explicitly make that visible. And that's a lot of extra resources and a lot of extra work for every single namespace, because it's a net effect of registering that service broker in every single namespace.
So, I mean, just to be clear, since you guys are doing your own aggregated API server, you know, these don't have to be real resources. They can, you know, you can implement some special sort of surfacing of these things as virtual mirrored resources that are read-only into all those namespaces and essentially make it be zero storage.
Is that possible? Do we have examples of that? 'Cause that's a really interesting idea.
Well, I mean, you're implementing the HTTP server, so you do whatever you want.
You can do whatever you want there. I think there's a question of does it fit with the generic server, blah, blah, blah. That's a different question, but from a model, that's something that's possible.
I think we do
have
this with the
examples.
Kubernetes service.
Yeah, we have examples of virtual resources today where you expose them in. I think name conflicts are kind of more the challenge there. And like this gets to so the real question, and this is where I think Brian was leading, was we initially put some things in namespaces and some things not. There have been a lot of reasons to put more things in namespaces. Like the two examples would be like nodes versus quota. We put quota in namespaces so that you could do segmentation. There are lots of people who want to now go do quota across namespaces from a shared bucket, which requires complexity. And the converse, you want to say, hey, here's a node for your namespace that you see a virtual version of, is the same problem from the other direction. If we were to do the namespace service broker, service catalog, we would need to have a way to expose all of that with the security things for existing users, right? But we might also have to go make a hard decision about whether we want everything to be namespaced or not. And I don't know that we're ready to make that one.
I feel like we're also sort of running up against, I mean, it's a big can of worms, but the fact that namespaces exist at all at some level, right? Like we're kind of trying to jam a whole bunch of stuff into this one concept. It's like organization and RBAC and visibility and all this stuff.
This conversation, Brendan.
I know, but I'm just saying, like, this is another. I mean, I think that we bend over backwards because of this, right?
We created a container, and if you have a container, it's easy to reason about some things about the container and hard to reason about other things about the container.
Yeah, I mean, there are ongoing proposals about how to manage namespaces, introducing, I think Joe has seen the proposal, so I think we will need to do something there to support more complex organizational hierarchies.
I hesitate at the term hierarchies.
I mean, people are trying to map their group and organization mechanisms onto the flat namespaces, and I think there are ways to do that. But with coming back to this specific question, since we're kind of getting a little bit off track, so we have a couple of patterns in the system. So with events, we had them namespaced and not namespaced. That was didn't really work well. So I definitely cannot advise that. We're actually going in the direction of having all events be namespaced. So the node events would be in Cube System or something like that. And it does simplify the model. OpenShift has some, since Clayton mentioned quota, has some, for things that were by default namespaced, it has some cluster level resources as well, like cluster resource quota and things like that. So that's the existing precedent that we have. We can either put cluster level things into a well-known namespace like Cube System, or you can have a cluster level thing and a private namespaced thing. And then we assume that at some point in the future, it will become easier to manage groups of namespaces through some kind of policy mechanism.
Like labels.
And actually a really good point.
Projects.
One thing with namespacing, putting things in namespaces, is that putting too many things in the same namespace flattens the security domain. So today, if you can get access, if you can create a pod in Cube System, you root the whole cluster because you have access to every service account and every static pod and so like if we go down the path of exposing into a namespace, we need to start partitioning in order to just to prevent the security problem that is bad from getting worse, where there's a ton of unrelated things in the same namespace.
Well, I think some of this is guidance and encouragement, sort of at what granularity do namespaces work. And my gut is to actually make namespaces more granular, but to do that, we need to provide policy mechanisms that exist above the namespace level for being able to synchronize these. I don't think this is necessarily hierarchy, because whatever hierarchy you define for one thing won't work for another thing. But I think it does have to be something that that sits above that level. I pointed to the Cube Arbiter stuff, which, starts talking about how do we actually balance quota across namespaces in a sort of, complex way that, synchronizes with batch admission, that type of thing. I think it's a great example of a place where we have to build something that sits above the namespace level.
But I mean, it sounds like the biggest objection to namespaced service broker is the discovery problem. Like, how do you actually discover? But I mean, that seems like something easily solved by the clustered administrator.
There's that, but there's also that
Operational management.
Yeah. So for operational management, like when you create a new namespace and you want to expose, I guess this is just the discovery problem. But let me add some constraints.
Just real quick. So Brian, were you talking about cross namespace referencing or this sort of namespace mirroring where we actually have stuff sort of like automatically mirrored and created across namespace?
I wasn't talking about either one of those exactly, but the chatter in the chat seemed to imply that one of the major issues with putting this service broker resources into some particular namespace is how users who are in their own namespaces actually discover those service broker resources.
Okay, so that'd be to the cross namespace stuff. Sorry, Paul, didn't mean to interrupt you. I was kind of making where Brian was going.
Well, the
okay.
cross namespace references is specific. Someone's typing very loudly.
Sorry, that's me.
So to add some constraints to the problem space here, we are very close to shipping a beta. I think that a number of folks that have been working on this at different vendors have schedules around this. So I think the question for me at this point is, do we differentiate the name of these global resources and give ourselves room to add namespace versions of them? So for example, do we call our current global resources like global service broker and global service class and global service plan or cluster, whatever?
Cluster whatever is the current convention.
Okay, so it sounds like perhaps what we ought to do is call these cluster, service broker, etc., and give ourselves room to add namespace versions that don't have an awkward name like local blah.
Yes.
That sounds reasonable to me. I mean, we cannot in this system at all different levels deal with namespaced and non-namespaced resources with the same name. Do not do that. Anyone should avoid that like the plague. You'll break everything and you'll spend the rest of your life fixing bugs.
Oh, I'm not that smart, but I'm not that dumb.
So just to be clear, if we were head down the path of having two resources that look virtually identical, except one is namespaced and one isn't, and the one that isn't is called global foo and the other one's just called foo, you guys are okay with that direction?
Yes.
Okay.
You can always deprecate the cluster and come back in at the local scope and leave that there.
Yeah,
Sure.
and implementation-wise, they can share the same type body, right? You just need a different outer type. You can even inline all the fields pretty easily
Doug,
without duplicating it.
just copy RBAC. This is what RBAC does.
Okay, thank you.
Good point.
I think we got our answer. Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks a lot.
Yep. So moving on, so let's continue to iterate on the proposal stuff online. And we have another topic. So I did go back, we talked about when I was sick, prioritizing the backlog. I didn't do a deep prioritization because things change so fast, and until we have more people actively working on stuff, it didn't seem to be particularly helpful to have a really deep backlog. But we do have an urgent issue that has come up. So the conformance effort is moving right along and is marching towards a launch of the initial effort. It is kind of being coordinated through CNCF, who's going to do the enforcement and logoing and all that kind of stuff. But the mechanism for actually executing the tests is owned by SIG testing, and the vetting of what should actually be tested is owned by SIG architecture. So I asked for an audit of the existing conformance tests. I just posted a link to the spreadsheet. I don't know what the access to this thing is. I can access it. Let me see.
I can too. This is Matt Farina.
It's Kubernetes dev.
All right.
Can write to it. Please don't accidentally hose it. The current list was auto-generated by Sonobui, I believe. And Mehdi asked for help in characterizing the tests. Basically, what I am looking for is a description of the API's features, behaviors that we believe are tested by each test, a short, ideally brief summary, so that I can review it and say, yeah, this makes sense. Almost certainly, Clayton already identified at least one thing that shouldn't have been in the list, and that got removed. So that's part of what we're trying to do here. I also want to identify gaps. Gaps are probably not going to be plugged in the initial version. They will just be noted that this is not tested yet, but expect someone to write a test, and then we will find people to either convert existing tests to conformance tests or write new tests to cover critical behaviors that are not captured by the existing 100+ tests. So if you have influence over any people who can help read through the 100+ tests and try to characterize, then that would be very helpful. Then we can make an audit pass as part of SIG architecture. And in some cases, I assume after, not everybody will put an equal level of detail into the summary. So we may need to ask for more detail to be added for some of these tests. So we can actually clarify what's really tested. But another issue, just an example issue that already came up that I haven't had time to respond to, is somebody asked, should all Kubernetes clusters be able to reach out to the internet? So I have an opinion about that, although I don't want to influence what other people's opinions are. But that is an example issue that can come out of a relatively thorough review that will be helpful to nail down.
On that particular issue, and I haven't talked to Tim what his thinking is on this stuff, but my Tim St. Clair is driving it from the Heptio point of view. I think we need to tease apart conformance versus useful diagnostics, right? Because I think obviously not every Kubernetes cluster is going to be reachable. Is going to be able to reach the internet.
Right. Yeah. So somehow we need.
Yet a lot of people will consider their cluster broken if that doesn't work, right? So there's
ingress and there's egress and there are firewalls and there's all kinds of stuff like that. But somehow we need some tests that usefully test that networking works, right? For different levels of reachability. So there may need to be a test that somehow you can reach something outside your cluster or something like that. I don't know. So anyway, I haven't looked at that specific issue in detail, but that's just an example of the kind of issues we want to come out of this audit.
Yeah, I think it's a good example also of the complexity that happens, because of course the current "Can I reach the internet" test uses ping, and ping is turned off in the Azure SDN, right? So it can reach the internet, but the test that you use is a cant, right?
Oh, is that noted in that issue, by the way?
I don't know if it's noted in that issue. I did a PR a while back to try and fix it, and it never quite got merged in. I'll probably resurrect that PR.
We've definitely seen folks stumble across that way.
But I think also part of the challenge is and this is the SRE monitoring philosophy, but we should be conforming on the symptoms, not the causes, right?
Good point.
We should be oh, this thing doesn't work, not, hey, you can't touch the internet.
Right.
So should there, because I see there's only so many tests here, should we know all the APIs that should be part of core and have a test for each of them? And then that could be like a conformance tool that could be used against this?
Ideally, yeah.
If someone's looking for a project long time ago, I wanted someone to write a REST coverage tester. Basically, you could put as an HTTP proxy that would give you a report back out.
Yeah, our API coverage, I believe, to be pretty poor in terms of like especially if you consider the error cases and things like that. We used to have a fairly rigorous complete test that was actually developed when we turned on auth at the beginning to verify, if you have access, then you get these kind of status codes. If you don't have access, then you get these kinds. But as the API surface has grown and we've added more features, I think our coverage has dropped over time. But we don't even can't even measure the coverage right now. So I think that's going to have to be a priority for next year for SIG testing, is to build things like coverage mechanisms, and then other individual teams who have APIs will need to build tests that exercise the functionality. API machinery maybe needs a test that just does requests, all the different possible requests, to do some basic API coverage. But yeah, I think our test suite is likely woefully inadequate, both of APIs and features and behaviors, like do pods get routable IPs, and can they talk to each other? Stuff like that, I think, is likely pretty poorly tested at the moment. We used to use Guestbook to exercise some of this stuff, to give you an idea of how spotty our coverage likely is. I think there was like at least 2 months that services didn't even work and we didn't notice. Okay, so there's that. So anyway, yeah, the conformance stuff, we're trying to wrap that up in the next couple of weeks, at least for the initial cut, have some sense of where we stand. So that is next on the priority list after the proposal process, which is also why I want to get the initial cut of the proposal process wrapped up. Otherwise, let's see. We have the work on the diagrams ongoing. Haven't had time to look at it since last week, but I would like to make some progress on that as well.
That's great. I have a whole new set of diagrams.
Oh,
I can share them out.
Great. That would be useful. Are you going to post links to the notes, or?
I can post links in the notes and make sure it's shareable. Let's see. I guess you're probably going to be most interested in. Let me see.
So who is this speaking, by the way? I see.
Oh, sorry. This is Matt Farina. Sorry, Matt Farina. I forgot to read. It always does SIG out when I join, and
with no video and the SIG thing, it's kind of tough sometimes.
Yeah. No, so here, I'll drop them in the notes as well. But here's a few diagrams. I tried to break it up based on API and component. More than this, and I'll share out the whole folder here in a minute, but these are the three that will probably be the most interesting right off the bat, Brian, to you. The first one is the APIs. I tried to document at each layer what are the different APIs that we currently have, including beta and alpha ones. The thing that I didn't include here that I was not sure about is where service catalog fell in. I know you had included that, but I'm not sure whether is that in and out of core, or is that considered ecosystem? I wasn't really sure.
Out of core.
Let's not use the word core. That name is just not helpful.
Well, so when we talk about the difference between something like userland and kernel comparing to Linux, what should we call the kernel for Kubernetes if not core?
So it's going to be more nuanced than that. And we have, you have in your diagrams the 3 layers: the nucleus, the application layer, and the governance layer. The governance layer, I think, so the way I've been thinking about them is the nucleus is, the minimum essential functionality that's not pluggable. And so you have that in the write-up. The application layer is all pluggable, but the those APIs are needed to do anything useful. The governance layer is like totally optional. So, and the governance layer has a bunch of APIs that right now are in Kubernetes, but they won't stay there.
But then we get to this idea of ecosystem, right? I just dropped another link into a diagram here because I've done a couple more diagrams to just try to explain that difference between what is Kubernetes at its core, or whatever word, versus the ecosystem, because I want to make sure that's communicated well, and it's easy to get confused.
Yeah, and we need to.
And I'm trying to come up with a good way to segment those two things. And so I just dropped a couple more diagrams in that try to help explain what that is. And that's where I'm running into a little bit of this trouble. What's ecosystem versus what's core? And so, because I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, I think we're going to have to refine. I don't know that I can come up with something solid off the top of my head right now, but we're going to have to refine the core and ecosystem terminology because, especially as we flesh out the governance for the project as a whole, they're going to be official projects which are at, outside these 3 main layers, and there are going to be projects that are not under the Kubernetes umbrella at all. So projects, maybe ecosystem encompasses everything, and we just have official projects and extensions or extended APIs or something like that. Yeah, we'll have to come up with a better way to distinguish things, especially as we come up with more clear-cut rules about what things should be in scope for the project as a whole versus out of scope. And I think you pointed out previously that there are some things which, if you squint, they seem to be at the same level, but we currently have a distinction because some are official Kubernetes projects and some are not. So we do have to work through some of those details still.
I wonder if it wouldn't be useful to actually draw out the actual dependencies between these APIs, rather than kind of philosophize about what layers things should be considered to be in. In practice, each one of these boxes depends on some other set of boxes, except the ones right at the bottom.
Have you seen my long document, Quentin?
You've written lots of long documents. Which one?
So anyway, I worked through that in my long document. I think new APIs have been created since then, so it needs to be updated. I don't know that we can capture it in a readable way in the diagram.
No, I wasn't meaning so much as it being the diagram, but maybe it would inform, what these layers are.
It did inform what the layers are.
Yeah. Okay. Then I retract my comment. So this is the result of that.
I think that this is not 100%. Yet more or less, yes, it is. I think these diagrams are not 100% accurate. I need to go back.
No. They are not 100% accurate. These are definitely draft form, and I'm sure even this morning I looked at it again and I went, ooh, this other thing belongs over here, and I moved something around. So
So anyway,
That's just me throwing something together pretty quickly.
yeah, no,
Try
thanks.
to
It's a good
encapsulate
start. Here's a link to my long document.
Thank
So would it be simplistic to think of it in a sort of different way and think of, so you've got something and then you've got a hinge point to some sort of extensibility? I mean, could we just think of it as anything on the left side of any extensibility point is the base, and then everything on the other side of the hinge point is the ecosystem?
Well, so one challenge is that the layering is kind of aspirational, and that's right now the API server and the controller manager are monolithic, and we're trying to make them not have to be monolithic. We're going to need more flexibility in how we produce release artifacts. Like some people may want an all-in-one binary for Minikube or Hypercube. Other people may want these things split out into separate components to make them more easily pluggable or scalable, things like that. So I think the goal is to get the code dependencies all sorted so we can move things into their proper repos for more independent development and make the API machinery work so that people could run these things outside the Nucleus API server and controller manager. I mean, it's possible we may even want to rebundle some of the components so we don't end up with 50 components running. We might, for example, want to combine the API server and controller manager into the same binary. I don't know.
Looking at this now, and I can't believe I'm going to say this. I think we almost need another layer here, because when I look at the Nucleus, there's core concepts that get exposed to users, and then there's a set of APIs here that are necessary for us to sort of bind together this sort of, you know, core control plane, right? And I'm looking at specifically like the token review API. Recently, Vault started using this for their authenticator. I think it's a mistake. I've called them out on that, and I'm talking to them about that. Really, that is like nobody besides like the kubelet should really be using that with the way that we do tokens right now. Because if you do it some other way, you're encouraging people to hand these tokens around willy-nilly, and it's a bad idea. So like things to actually sort of like we're going to have to create new APIs as we explode out the control plane. And as we do more aggregation, and those APIs are not necessarily user-facing like Pod. They really feel like they're at a different layer or different group than something like Pod.
Although some are, like subject access review, you might think, well, that's
yeah, that one I think, you know, that's a little bit of like, hey, what's going to happen here, which is useful thing. That's a different thing than like token review, which is a scary ass API from a sort of security patterns point of view.
I mean, also we had talked about grouping, for example, the, you know, in each of these layers, I had at least two main buckets. So grouping these according to those buckets. You know, Nucleus is API machinery and the execution side, pods and nodes and so on. The application layer, deployment and routing, the governance layer, automation and policy. So I think it would be helpful to group according to those two separate categories in each layer.
So one layering might be sort of just API machinery there, stuff that's not Kubernetes specific at all.
Well, that's not a layer. The API machinery is going to get broken out into a separate project that can be reused by other projects.
Yeah. I mean, like
so that's not a layer, that's libraries. But the API, the Nucleus API server itself is a component that exposes APIs like component status, although that's an API I hate.
Yes. Component status is a great example. Yeah.
But in any case, the API machinery related stuff that's in here is not referring to the generic libraries, which is like gRPC. Is gRPC a box? Would gRPC be a box?
But I'm thinking like a lot of the authorization stuff is really API machinery stuff. As we have ways for registering and tracking components within a system, configuring the aggregation of the API server, we may have some stuff around component config and sort of like, you know,
and mission control hooks.
Yeah. This stuff is relatively,
but it's needed by developers who are building stuff on top of the API. Like if you look at the discovery APIs or the subject access reviews, stuff like that. People who are building clients will need to use these APIs. So yeah, on the API machinery side, very few of the APIs, other than event, are actually really user-facing. It's really all the execution stuff that is user-facing at the nucleus level, which I think is actually the right thing, right? Like, the nucleus is the foundation for building everything else. And most users don't even directly use pods for the most part. They don't directly create them anyway. I mean, they observe them.
They know they exist, yeah.
They know they exist. So actually, I think that's a good sign. You know, we could call the application layer almost like the user space layer or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, so are these? So Matt, how do you want feedback on these? Should people? Are they shared for editing, or should we make a copy and?
The links that I shared out for y'all should give you edit permissions.
Okay, so do you want us to edit them, or do you want us to make copies, or?
You can feel free to edit or leave comments on it, and then I'll go back and I can clean them up and try and make them consistent and that kind of thing. But feel free to either edit them or make comments if there's a change, and I can worry about cleaning up alignments and stuff like that later.
Okay, well, if I find half an hour when stuff is not catching on fire all the time, I will try to move some things around to apply a little bit more organization.
And I'll put them into the groupings you wanted. I know what you're talking about, so I can do that bit. But if there's something that's in the wrong layer, or if there's a comment you want to make on it, go ahead and feel free to do that. But that grouping one, I know what you meant, and I can do that.
Okay, so the grayed out things are...
it's based on, you'll see that things that are less gray are in the same API groups. So V1 Beta 1, V1 Beta 2, V1 Alpha 1, that's where you'll see the colors change.
I see. Okay.
It's based on their API status, which I think I got it right for 1.8. I'll double check.
Oh, I see. So beta is gray.
So beta 2 is a little lighter gray, beta 1 is a little lighter. Then you'll see some color change around alphas that differentiate the different alphas, and that's how it's broken up.
Cool.
And these are draft. I do expect a lot of feedback and changes need to be done. So, and I tried to incorporate what you asked for last week in the diagrams.
So who do we imagine is going to be the consumer for this?
So I imagine the first consumer to be Kubernetes contributors.
Okay. Yeah, no, I think it definitely feels like an inside baseball type of thing because most users.
It totally is. And I'm trying to provide some clarity for. So we've had this explosion of APIs, and yes, we will have to, I expect, have a moratorium on new APIs next year. In the Kubernetes anyway. We have about 60 now.
That's kind of scary.
Yeah, they're not all here. Like CRD was added after I wrote my document, so it's not here. So yeah, with that many APIs, it's definitely needs to be made clear to all these people who are working on these APIs how they fit into the bigger picture, and yeah, what things can they depend on? Should they assume that there must be an implementation in the system? For example, I deliberately put ingress in the application layer. Today, their API is there by default, but it has no implementation by default. However, anybody doing anything needs L7 load balancing. Like anybody writing a microservice or a web app and deploying that needs L7 load balancing. So I want batteries included default implementation for ingress. Like this is one of the #1 things that people like about Swarm compared to Kubernetes. It definitely should be pluggable like everything else in the application layer. You can swap out the scheduler, you can swap out kubeproxy. But there's no good reason why we just shouldn't have L7 load balancing. in the system.
Yeah,
Now,
I'm talking to Tim about that stuff. Tim Hawken.
yeah, and I think Tim is on board with that as well. I'm not necessarily happy with the current Ingress API. We need to make some changes to it, but we need something that fills a roughly ingress shaped hole in that layer. So as I was saying, this is somewhat aspirational, but I think hopefully it will inform future development.
So Matt, one suggestion here that may make it clear is that there's things that are obviously tightly coupled, like 4 or 5 different things around RBAC, right? Or four objects around RBAC. And so doing some sort of like drawing a box around those and then just listing the APIs might make it clear and make this thing feel a little bit less noisy.
Yeah, that would be great.
That's a good idea. Thanks.
I would assume one of the main kind of consumers of this would be applications wanting to know, how much of Kubernetes do I need to install in order to get this application to work properly? And where exactly do we stand on the idea of having, is that what these layers are intended to be, that you can install a red layer only, or a red plus blue layer, or red plus blue plus green? Sorry, I'm just making up the colors because I don't have the picture in front of me. Is that
I thought you were colorblind, Quinn?
Eventually, like once we get the governance layer APIs moved out of the core V1 monolithic API group, and we get API aggregation fully fleshed out, and we move all the code around, then yes, it might be possible to run without that layer. But I would like this to inform, for example, what resources make sense in a Helm chart. My opinion is the governance layer APIs probably don't belong in an off-the-shelf configuration. Those are things that people are almost always going to want to customize. I would like to see some tooling to auto-generate some of that stuff. For example, I'm starting to see RBAC rules in a bunch of Helm charts, but the auth policy is completely pluggable even today, right? Like you can run your totally different auth mechanism. It would be really easy, I think, to write a tool that could auto-generate the auth policies you need from the resources themselves.
So Quentin, I'm going to actually disagree with Brian here a little bit. When he first wrote this document with the architectural layers, I think there was some confusion on whether this was the conformance effort or not the conformance effort. And I think this can help us inform sort of what are the APIs, what's the behavior that we need to be conformant. But I don't think layers mean conformance. And I think
I agree with that actually.
Yeah, and maybe it's just wording. But I think when users come to it and they're like, well, what type of cluster do I need to run this application? I see that as a conformance profile versus actually a layering type of thing. Because we have to provide some guidance to users of like, will this application work on this cluster? And I think I don't think this is necessarily it completely.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right, so there's the concept of profiles has been discussed. I think you also suggested modules or something like that, Joe.
If you look at CSS, it's a combination of these things, but like we can.
Yeah.
So, but even in this, right, because Brian, I'm feeding off some of the notes that I took from you last week, right? The nucleus and the application layer, you said were required. So if we're dealing with conformance, we can look at these sets and say these sets and these versions are required, right?
Yes.
But we can say governance is optional. So in conformance testing, we've got an easy picture to say, okay, this set is optional. And so this isn't required. So if you're doing like portable, charts, you can say, oh, we shouldn't do anything in the governance layer because that's entirely optional on a cluster, but everything else is required, even if it's pluggable.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit dual purpose. And actually, Tim had started the document, and it was more geared towards conformance, and then I kind of took over and took it in a different direction. But yeah, yes, I agree. Ideally, we should be able to you have the layering inform those kind of decisions as well.
And I want to be careful about words like required. It's like nobody requires you to do anything. What we can say is that if you don't include these things, then like no warranties, it's not well tested, you're on your own, you're off the map.
Yeah, you're not guaranteed that an off-the-shelf Kubernetes configuration will work.
I mean, to be clear, one of the reasons for my question stroke comment earlier was that I'm not totally convinced that we haven't got like too many things in each layer. I mean, I can see there's a convenience in not having an infinite number of layers, but
yes,
if I was building a particular kind of application, let's say like a batch processing thing or something, and maybe I don't need any like storage, and I don't need any L7 load balancing, and I don't need any of that stuff. I can imagine like taking a subset of the nucleus as it's shown on the diagram, throw away all the storage stuff and maybe some other stuff, and say that's what I need of Kubernetes. At least theoretically, I should be able to build a cluster like that and run my application, and everything should work.
It's open source. It's a toolkit. You can do what you want, but there's no way we're going to test that level of configurability. There's like zero chance that we are going to support that level of configurability. It's way, way too complicated testing-wise.
So, but like you can build a non-conformant cluster, you can do your thing.
Yes.
There's no guarantees. It's going to be up to you. But I will say, and if something like that catches on and it actually becomes something that a lot of users want, then let's define that as a new sort of conformancy type of thing, and then let's start testing it, because there's obviously user demand. So I don't think that this is necessarily, like Brian says, zero chance. I would say if you bring the users, then that speaks for itself.
Okay, so I'm just thinking like next 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, without sort of like a really strong existence proof that that's something that everybody wants, it is what it is.
Yeah. But I mean, definitely a lot of things are going to have to change before that is kind of feasible. And right now we can barely keep our tests running. So, and the project will need to be in a much better shape before we can support that many different kinds of configurations. But yes,
So,
I mean, you don't have to be conformant to use Kubernetes. There's no requirement that says that anywhere.
But you'll probably have to be conformant to advertise that you are Kubernetes.
To be certified Kubernetes.
Yeah. There's some definition of advertised and certified and all that.
Yeah.
So we're at time, my friends. So looks like there's already something in the works for the office hours. Somebody put something in there for next week. So anything else before we go here? Is there anything else crucial?
I just want to give one last plug again for people who can help fill out the conformance test audit, or find people who can help with that.
So to make that easier, I created a bit.ly, so bit.ly/KatesConformance, and it'll go to that spreadsheet. So you can tell people, go to Kate's Conformance, and they'll be able to find it a lot easier than.
Oh, cool. Is that in the notes?
No, but I'll put it there now.
Thanks.
All right, and then let's on PRs or on the proposal process. So that is still ongoing. So
okay,
folks should be looking at that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.